I think about everything I have is quirky in that whenever you think something is going to happen or work out, it never works out the way you think it's going to go. So the beauty of revenue management, it always keeps you on your toes and don't always expect the worst, but a lot of times it's not going to be just a smooth slam dunk process you think it should be.
Welcome to episode 3 of the Spotlight podcast. So far in this series, we've established that every sellout tells a different story. Up to this point, we've discussed the importance of demand drivers, the booking curve, and how pricing and rate evolution determines our ability to stick the landing and get that perfect sellout. In this episode, we're going to shift gears and talk about how market segmentation factors into reaching that 100% mark. Thankfully, we've been lucky enough to snag 2 really awesome guests from one of the top management companies here in the US. In just a bit, we're going to hear from Kim Welch and Nick Larsen from Schulte Hospitality. They are 2 very seasoned revenue leaders who have a lot of great insight on market segmentation and how it fits into their broader revenue management picture there at Schulte. So without further ado, let's get into it for episode 3. So before we dive right into it, let's lay a little bit of a foundation here. What is market segmentation? Market segmentation is simply the process of dividing up our guests into smaller, distinct groups with common characteristics, so we can make better insights around our data and control how and when these segments book. This is especially useful for those high-demand sellout nights that this podcast series is all about. So if you've heard pundits over the past couple of years mentioning that
group business, large groups, mostly corporates, are booking through the end of the year, into next year, into the following year now.
The corporate events sector is hoping conferences will still be considered an essential reason to travel.
Then you've actually already been exposed to market segmentation. But what we do as revenue managers day to day is obviously going to be quite a bit more detailed. The truth is that market segmentation is part art, part science. But don't worry, all you have to do for an effective market segmentation strategy is, I would recommend taking your government business, contract. You're going to have to make a decision on whether or not you break those 3 out into their contract. Okay, sorry for the dumb joke. My point is that there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's as complicated or as simple as you want to make it. But if you do want to learn a little bit more about market segmentation in a bit more detail than I go into in the podcast episode, be sure to check out the blog for this episode. But ask any revenue manager how they segment their business, and they will probably tell you that there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into it. Thankfully, though, there is a major commonality across virtually all hotels that allows us to build market segments somewhat logically. And that would be rate plans. Every reservation that is created has a rate plan. And while they can look wildly different depending on your tech stack, one of the most effective ways that we segment guests in the revenue management world is by combining the production of similar rate plans into market segments. There isn't a right or wrong way to segment your guests, but what's most important is that you implement some kind of system of segmentation and make an effort to stick to it and keep the data as clean as possible. If you're able to do this, then certain insights will start to come to life. So let's do a little thought exercise here. Imagine that you have a really big event coming up on the near-term horizon. Ask yourself, would you only want government segment guests staying for that event? What about only corporate guests? Your answer to both of these questions is probably no, even if you aren't an RM. The reason why is you instinctively know that a bit of variety is probably a good thing. So if you know that a mix of different guests is a good thing, you can work towards optimizing that mix and adapting it to various scenarios. You may discover that your cruise segment is actually displacing tons of lucrative transient business for potential sellouts, or that you should actually be taking more OTA business on your high occupancy nights. And if you want to control your market mix, then we're going to have to introduce the concept of yielding certain segments. For example, if we have that same big event coming up on our calendar, and we know that we don't want any government stays, then what we can do is yield those rate plans or that particular segment and perhaps only allow a fixed number of government segment guests, or we could close out that bucket entirely. So I'll stop here because I want to make sure that we give our guests plenty of time to discuss how they handle segmentation at Schulte, and they'll be able to explain it much better than I can here in these couple of minutes. And by the way, if you like what you're hearing so far, and maybe you want to learn more about the products that are allowing you to do this kind of market segment analysis, be sure to go to mylighthouse.com/podcast demo. Let's get into our interview. So let's get Kim's intro first.
I have been in revenue management for, probably longer than I want to admit. But I started out as a reservations manager at an independent hotel in downtown Chicago, and then relocated and saw a job for a revenue manager. This is when revenue management was still kind of a new thing. And it was just one of those where, I couldn't do that job. I don't even know how to do that, when it was basically what I was already doing as a reservations manager. So kind of slowly got into that, and been with Schulte now for almost 10 years. Currently in a vice president role. Myself and Nick kind of split out our portfolio and support a team of regional directors of revenue in their jobs, and also, still revenue manage a couple of hotels of our own.
And then here's a little intro from Nick Larsen.
I've been with Schulte for 5.5 years now, also a VP of revenue, as Kim mentioned. Prior to that, I've spent, 2001 is when I started officially in revenue management. My hotel career goes back a little bit further. My first role was actually in the housekeeping department as a housekeeper for economy lodgings. So I've seen quite a bit of things over the past several years. I won't age myself too much there. But got into revenue management back in 2001 and just have loved it ever since. It's a different challenge every day of the week. So it's a fun part of the hotel industry, to say the least.
So I wanted to start very broad with my first question that I asked of Kim and Nick. So the first thing I got into was I wanted to know how specifically they used market segmentation analysis in their sellout strategy there at Schulte.
I think when you talk about perfect sell, you automatically think about, the goal is always to get the highest amount of revenue and all that stuff. But what it really boils down to is kind of a demand tactic. And the way that we kind of look at things is we have our own little demand designations for different days. We talk kind of about an internal, external occupancy demand and traditional demand. And where market segmentation fits into that is really, what do you need? What's your optimal mix to sell out for that kind of demand day? So it's not just if you start picking up, you're automatically closing out your discounts, or if you're not picking up, you're not necessarily selling your lowest rates either. It's really all about your historical demand for that hotel on that day and where you designate it.
I really like that response from Kim because it reinforces the fact, again, that not all of these sellouts are going to be the exact same. So it sounds like what they're doing at Schulte is they're actually designating different days as having different types of demand, which I thought was really interesting. Next, listen to what Nick has to say.
The only thing I think I'll add is that when you're looking at the market segmentation, if you've got a brand system, you definitely want to be monitoring your last room availables or your hurdle values, whatever the specific brand uses, because that can get you in trouble in some spots if it's too aggressive or not aggressive enough. So you definitely want to be following your pace reports, your market segmentation, to get that ideal sellout that you're going after.
Next, I wanted to basically dispel a myth. I think that us as revenue managers, a lot of times we think that there is maybe this kind of like ideal market mix that we should always be striving for. So I wanted to get their take on whether or not that kind of elusive, universally perfect market mix actually exists, or how they handle and how they think about the ideal market mix for a sellout.
I really think it truly depends on what you're going for. I used to have a hotel back in another life that it would sell out no matter what on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but it still needed some of that discount business to sell out. And so it was more a traditional mix for us is that traditionally the hotel would always get to this occupancy by selling this mix of business. Also different for, a special event like a Taylor Swift concert or a Super Bowl is that that is a super high external demand that you can sell everything at your highest rate and everything. So I think it really truly depends on what the day is and what you're aiming for that time.
And I also love this comment that Nick made right here.
Yeah, not all markets and events are created equally. Location comes into play, market comes into play. We've had hotels and markets with Super Bowls, and you would think that's a slam dunk for a sellout, and we found ourselves having to lower rates or open up government last minute just because you've got to hit those sellout numbers, but it is not always coming through retail. And it's not just a hotel industry. You've got people that'll put their houses up for rent over these special event times, and that just throws another unique layer into the mix of what you've got to look for from a supply standpoint to maximize your revenues on the special events.
I love that Nick brought up short-term rentals. Honestly, I don't think we'll have time to get to them in this particular season of the podcast, but trust me, they will be featured at some point. But that's really interesting because that actually speaks sort of to like the supply side of things, right? So he had, that Super Bowl event that sounds like maybe it was a little bit lackluster from a demand perspective. Again, because he had those short-term rentals that he had to contend with. So that's why he brings up market segmentation and says, hey, we had to bring in these government rooms to achieve the sellout. Very, very interesting stuff from Nick on that one. Next up, what I wanted to know was what attributes are Nick and Kim looking for within these certain segments when they're going for a perfect sellout, right? Are they looking at things like, just ADR, maybe lead time plays into it, length of stay, things like that. So listen to what Nick had to say for this one.
I think the length of stay and stay pattern are important, but there's also, if you've got a hotel that doesn't have a complimentary breakfast, if you've got F&B operations on site, there are certain segments that you're going to get more incremental revenue out of than other segments. So making sure that you may not close out potentially some BT that your business customer is going to spend a little bit more in your F&B outlets if they've got an expense account they can put it towards, versus a AAA member or an OTA guest that's going to book through.
That was a really nice observation from Nick because it really kind of speaks to what's known as total revenue management. So we're not just looking at ADR, right? We don't have our blinders on and we're only focused on what was the room rate for night one. We're looking at kind of that total ancillary spend along with their stay pattern. So I really, really like that call out that he made. Next up, Kim brought up a quick point as well.
I think even when you're talking about from a forecasting standpoint, Nick and I talk about a lot this when we do forecast trading and stuff, is that if you have a large group that you decided to take because the F&B was there and you're getting something else there, but it doesn't fit your normal pattern, making sure that you're forecasting that your shoulder nights are not going to pick up as much as they normally would with your BT business. But then at the same point, you still need some of that BT business because that's what's coming in. So you really have to look at the different segmentation to see like where you can also fill in otherwise, even though you made a different business decision than you wanted.
And again, Kim kind of reinforces that point that Nick made where they're looking at multiple factors. Notice that Kim brought up the shoulder dates around an event and making sure that those don't get stranded when you're evaluating a piece of business. So all really, really good stuff on that front. Next up, I wanted to know what tools that they were using at Schulte to track and monitor market segmentation, because obviously you have to have some kind of tools to do this analysis. So let's see what some of the pros are using.
Well, before we were on Lighthouse, I would definitely say that, one of the things, and it seems so silly, is just looking at the reservation reports out of the PMS systems and not even necessarily the revenue management systems, is that it's seeing that physical rate and what picked up, and the rate code that picked up is, I think a lot of us revenue folks are very visual people, and so seeing it that way kind of helps break it down more. And then now when you look at the heat map in Lighthouse and BI, like it's absolutely wonderful because you can drill down so far to kind of see on a daily basis what's picking up, and you start to learn patterns by what's picking up just by looking at the rate code specifically.
And here are some thoughts from Nick
So Lighthouse has been incredible for this, for that daily pickup report, to be able to monitor where we're seeing things to come through at. I'm really not trying to do a sales pitch for Lighthouse. It has been a great tool to add into the collection here. But one of the other ones is the communication with the property, with the GMs, the front office managers, and the director of sales, that if they're seeing frequent guests try and come through that are getting blocked out, if it's a repeat customer, or if it's a rate that accidentally sneaked through, that is something that you've got to have the lines of communication open on, so you can figure out what may not be necessarily captured on a report because of rate overrides or whatever else may be going on locally at the hotel.
Finally, I wanted to get basically just some words of wisdom from Kim and Nick and see if we missed anything that we didn't get a chance to touch on. And they did bring up a couple of really, really good points towards the end of the interview.
I think one of the things that I did want to add too is that from a market segmentation standpoint, when you look at the day-by-day screen.
Just a quick note, Kim is talking about the day-by-day view within Lighthouse Business Intelligence there.
And kind of look at the market segmentation that way, and you kind of see, again, it kind of goes back to your demand tactic and what you're looking for. And I think that helps a lot when you're also going over group business. And it's an education for salespeople that they sometimes want to sell a really high rate over dates, but then you go back and you look at your historical and you see it on a day-by-day basis, and you're like, well, we have this discount and this discount. So, you know, if you're booking this group at maybe a little bit lower rate than you're thinking, we're already ahead because we're selling it at higher than what the discounts were. And so I think, again, as people being visual, it makes more sense in an education to salespeople to see it kind of on paper instead of us just trying to say, oh no, take a lower rate or do this or do that. I think it really helps to educate them into a different way of thinking because they can actually see it on a screen or on, you know, to actually see how it actually breaks down.
All right, now that we know a little bit more about market segmentation and how it plays into these perfect sellouts, I came up with just a few different exercises and takeaways that you can do here at the end of the episode. So the first one that I'm going to recommend is to take a look at a recent perfect sellout that you had and analyze your market mix for that particular night. And from there, take a look at the lead time for each of these segments. So where did they book along the booking curve? So how far in advance? And when I was coming up with the podcast script and the blog, I was actually looking at a real hotel myself, and I found out something really cool. This particular hotel, 0% of their retail rooms booked more than 50 days out. And actually 50% of their total retail production happened in the final week leading up to arrival. So do that analysis yourself, see if you find out anything interesting about your hotel. And then second, do a similar analysis to look at the average length of stay for the different segments that comprise that sellout. So remember earlier when Kim was mentioning shoulder dates and benefiting the shoulder dates around the sellouts, that's another great exercise that you can do. And then finally, the third big takeaway is try what Schulte's doing. So for your next high occupancy date that you potentially think you will have a sellout, try forecasting by segment. So if you've got a 100-room hotel and you've got a date coming up where you're forecasting, maybe 104 rooms of demand or 120 rooms of demand, try to actually break that out into the different segments. So maybe you've got 50 rooms of retail demand and 20 rooms of government demand or something like that. And see if that helps you come up with a more accurate, more intuitive forecast. Again, you can use a lot of the Lighthouse suite of products to kind of help you come up with that forecast, but that should be a fun, very enlightening exercise if you actually take the time to do it. I hope that you've enjoyed this third episode here of the Spotlight Podcast. Just a reminder, if you want to see any of the products that I used coming up with the blog or coming up with the podcast, be sure to visit mylighthouse.com/podcast demo. And in our next episode, we'll be speaking with Connor Vanderholm of Topline Revenue Management Solutions, and we'll be looking over cancellations and how they affect our perfect sellouts. Thanks for listening.